The town of Ridgewood, Texas, sat at the edge of the hill country, where the land turned brown in summer and the sky stretched forever. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where church bells rang on Sunday mornings, and where people still waved at strangers from their pickup trucks. Margaret Maggie Dalton had lived there for 41 years. She had raised her daughter in a small house on Pecan Street. She had taught Sunday school at First Baptist. She had volunteered at the Veterans Hall every Memorial Day and Veterans Day, cooking meals for the old-timers who gathered to share stories. Now, at 63 years old, she was about to lose everything. The trouble had started 6 months ago when developers from Houston announced plans to build a luxury resort on the edge of town. They needed water rights, they needed land, and they needed the people of Ridgewood to get out of their way. Most folks sold quickly. The developers offered good money, enough to start over somewhere else. But Maggie refused. Her property sat on 30 acres of land that had been in her family for 4 generations. Her great-grandfather had built the original farmhouse. Her grandfather had planted the oak trees that still shaded the front yard. Her mother was buried in a small cemetery on the hill overlooking the creek. She would not sell, not for any price. The developers had tried everything. They had offered more money. They had made threats. They had sent lawyers with complicated documents full of words designed to confuse and intimidate. When none of that worked, they had found another way. A zoning violation. According to the developer's lawyers, Maggie's property was in violation of a municipal code that had been passed 20 years ago. Something about setback requirements and agricultural classifications. Technical nonsense that no one had ever enforced before. But now suddenly it was being enforced against her. The penalty was severe. If the town council ruled against her, she would be forced to sell her property at a reduced rate. The developers would get exactly what they wanted. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the Ridgewood Town Hall. Maggie arrived early, wearing her Army dress uniform. She had served for 26 years, enlisted at 17, retired as a command sergeant major at 43. She had deployed to Desert Storm, to Bosnia, to Afghanistan. She had earned medals that most soldiers only read about in history books. She wore them all tonight. Not to show off, not to intimidate, but to remind herself and everyone else who she was, what she had done, what she had sacrificed for the right to live on her own land in her own country. The town hall was a modest building with wooden floors and fluorescent lights. Folding chairs had been set up in rows facing a long table where the town council sat. There were 5 council members. 3 of them had been appointed in the last year after the previous members resigned unexpectedly. The new members all had connections to the development company. The fix was in, Maggie knew it, but she had come to fight anyway. The council chairman was a man named Harold Briscoe. He was 55, slick-haired, with the smile of a used car salesman. He had moved to Ridgewood only 3 years ago, but somehow he had risen to lead the council. When Maggie walked in, Briscoe's smile tightened. "Mrs. Dalton, thank you for joining us." "Command Sergeant Major Dalton," she corrected quietly. "Retired." Briscoe waved his hand dismissively. "Of course, please take a seat. We'll begin shortly." Maggie sat in the front row. Behind her, the gallery was half full, mostly townspeople she had known for decades. Some looked sympathetic, others avoided her eyes. A man in an expensive suit sat at a table to the left. This was Vincent Cross, the lead attorney for Meridian Development Group. He had flown in from Houston specifically for this hearing. He looked at Maggie's uniform and smirked. "Nice outfit," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Planning to invade somewhere after this." A few people laughed nervously. Maggie said nothing. She had faced worse than lawyers in her life. Briscoe called the hearing to order. "We're here tonight to address a zoning violation filed against the property at 1847 Pecan Street, owned by Margaret Dalton." He shuffled some papers. "Mr. Cross, please present your case." Cross stood and buttoned his jacket. "Thank you, Chairman Briscoe. This is a straightforward matter. Mrs. Dalton's property is in violation of Municipal Code 47B, which requires a minimum setback of 50 feet from any classified waterway. Her barn sits 43 feet from Willow Creek. That's a clear violation." He held up a map. The code was passed in 2003 to protect water quality and prevent flooding. It applies to all properties in the affected zone. Mrs. Dalton is not exempt simply because she's lived here a long time. He sat down with a satisfied smile. Briscoe nodded. Mrs. Dalton, would you like to respond? Maggie stood slowly. Her leg ached, an old injury that flared up in cold weather. That barn was built in 1952 by my grandfather. It's been standing in the same spot for over 70 years. Nobody ever said anything about a violation until your friends from Houston decided they wanted my land. Cross interrupted. Chairman, the defendant's personal history is irrelevant. The code is the code. The code was never enforced against anyone else, Maggie replied. Tom Harrison's shed is 30 feet from the same creek. Martha Jennings has a chicken coop practically in the water. Why aren't they here tonight? Briscoe shifted uncomfortably. We're not here to discuss other properties, Mrs. Dalton. We're here to discuss yours. Maggie looked at him steadily. You're here to take my land. Let's at least be honest about it. The room went quiet. Cross stood again. Chairman, I move that we proceed to a vote. The evidence is clear. The violation is documented. There's no need for further discussion. Briscoe nodded quickly. All in favor of... Wait. Maggie's voice was firm. I have the right to present my own evidence. I have the right to call witnesses. You can't just railroad me out of my own property. Briscoe sighed heavily. Fine, you have 10 minutes. Maggie turned to face the crowd. I've lived in this town my whole life. I served my country for 26 years. I buried my husband and my mother on that land. And now you're going to take it from me over 7 feet of setback. She touched the medals on her chest. This Bronze Star, I earned it pulling wounded soldiers out of a burning convoy in Iraq. This Purple Heart, I got it when a mortar round took half my hearing and left shrapnel in my leg. Her voice hardened. I didn't serve my country so that some corporation could steal my home. The room was silent. Then Cross spoke. Chairman, this is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation we expected. Mrs. Dalton's military service, while admirable, has nothing to do with zoning regulations. He pointed at her uniform. In fact, I find it inappropriate that she's wearing that uniform in a civilian hearing. It's clearly designed to prejudice the council. Briscoe nodded slowly. I agree. Mrs. Dalton, I'm going to have to ask you to remove those medals. This is a zoning matter, not a military ceremony. Maggie stared at him. Excuse me. The medals, take them off. You're using them to influence the proceedings. Maggie's hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage. These medals are part of my uniform. They represent 26 years of service to this country. I will not remove them. Briscoe's face hardened. Then I'll have you removed from this hearing entirely. The room erupted in murmurs. Maggie stood her ground. And at that moment, the doors of the town hall burst open. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. A man strode through the doors like he owned the building. He was tall and straight-backed, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite. He wore the full dress uniform of the United States Army, and on his shoulders gleamed 2 silver stars. A major general. Behind him walked a woman in civilian clothes, carrying a thick briefcase, and 2 military police officers in formal uniforms. The general's eyes swept the room. They landed on the council table, then moved to Maggie. Command Sergeant Major Dalton, he said. His voice was deep and commanding. I apologize for the interruption. Maggie's eyes widened. General Harrison. Major General Robert Harrison stopped in the center of the room. He turned to face Chairman Briscoe, who had gone pale as a sheet. I'm told there's some confusion about the legitimacy of this woman's service. I'm here to clear that up. Briscoe sputtered. General, this is a closed municipal hearing. You have no authority. I have exactly the authority I need. Harrison's voice cut through the room like a blade. I'm here as a private citizen and a character witness. Is there a rule against that? Cross stood quickly. This is highly irregular. The defense didn't list any witnesses. I'm not here for the defense, Harrison said. I'm here for the truth. He walked toward the council table. The military police officers positioned themselves at the doors. My name is Robert Harrison. I served in the United States Army for 38 years. I commanded troops in Desert Storm, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And for 3 of those years, Command Sergeant Major Margaret Dalton served directly under my command. He stopped in front of Briscoe. I know exactly who she is and what she's done. The question is, do you? Briscoe's confidence had evaporated. He glanced at Cross for support, but the lawyer looked just as rattled. General, we're not questioning Mrs. Dalton's military service. This is a simple zoning matter. There's nothing simple about what's happening here. Harrison turned to address the entire room. I've spent the last week looking into this situation. What I've found is deeply disturbing. He gestured to the woman with the briefcase. This is Patricia Coleman, an attorney from the Judge Advocate General's Corps. She's been reviewing the legal aspects of this case. Patricia stepped forward and set her briefcase on the table. I'll get straight to the point. The zoning violation cited against Mrs. Dalton is based on Municipal Code 47B, passed in 2003. However, that code includes a grandfather clause that exempts any structure built before 1990. She pulled out a document. Mrs. Dalton's barn was built in 1952. It is clearly exempt under the grandfather clause. This violation should never have been filed. The room buzzed with whispers. Cross jumped to his feet. That's not accurate. The grandfather clause only applies to residential structures, not agricultural. I have the original text of the code right here. Patricia held up a thick binder. Would you like me to read it aloud? Cross's face reddened. This is a delaying tactic. The council has already reviewed. The council reviewed falsified documents. General Harrison's voice silenced the room. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. This is a report from an independent investigator hired by concerned citizens of Ridgewood. It documents multiple irregularities in how this case was handled. He unfolded the paper and began reading. First, the zoning violation was filed by an employee of Meridian Development Group, not a municipal official. Second, the property assessment used to determine the violation was conducted without notifying the property owner, a violation of state law. Third, 3 members of this town council have received payments from Meridian Development totaling over $200,000 in the past year. The room exploded. People jumped to their feet. Voices shouted over each other. Briscoe banged his gavel, but no one was listening. Order, orders. Harrison waited for the chaos to subside. Then he continued. Chairman Briscoe, you received $87,000 from Meridian Development last March. Councilmember Patterson received $62,000. Councilmember Rhodes received $54,000. He dropped the paper on the table. Those payments were disguised as consulting fees, but there's no record of any consulting work being performed. Briscoe's face was the color of ash. This is slander you can't prove. I can prove all of it. Harrison's eyes were cold. Bank records, emails, witness statements, it's all documented. He turned to face the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing is not a zoning hearing. It's a coordinated attempt to steal land from a decorated war hero. A woman who spent 26 years defending this country. A woman who asked for nothing in return except the right to live out her days on her family's property. He pointed at Briscoe. And this man, this council, was willing to throw her out like garbage so their corporate friends could build a resort. Briscoe stood abruptly. This hearing is adjourned. Sit down. Harrison's voice was thunder. You don't get to run away from this, not tonight. Briscoe hesitated, then slowly sank back into his chair. Harrison turned to Maggie. Sergeant Major Dalton, I should have come sooner. I only learned about this situation last week when an old friend called me. I came as fast as I could. Maggie's eyes were glistening. General, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. You've earned the right to be left in peace, and I'm going to make sure that happens. He faced the council one more time. I'm placing this evidence in the hands of the Texas Attorney General's office. There will be a full investigation, and if the people on this council have broken the law, they will face consequences. He paused. But that's not why I really came here tonight. The room went quiet. I came because someone told this woman to take off her medals, and that I could not let stand. General Harrison stood in the center of the town hall, every eye fixed on him. Command Sergeant Major Dalton served her country with distinction for 26 years. Most of you know that. What you don't know is the full extent of what she did, because much of it was classified. He paused, letting the words sink in. Until now. He gestured to Patricia, who opened her briefcase and pulled out another folder. This one was thick, bound in a dark cover with military seals. Last week, I personally petitioned the Department of Defense to declassify portions of Sergeant Major Dalton's service record. Given the circumstances, they agreed. Maggie looked stunned. General, you didn't have to. Yes, I did. Harrison took the folder and opened it. Because the people in this room deserve to know exactly who they've been trying to destroy. He began to read. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, Sergeant First Class Margaret Dalton was part of a supply convoy that came under heavy enemy fire. When the lead vehicle was hit by an RPG and caught fire, Dalton left her protected position, crossed 50 meters of open ground under continuous fire, and pulled 3 wounded soldiers from the burning wreckage. He looked up at the crowd. She received the Bronze Star with valor for that action. The citation notes that she sustained shrapnel wounds to her left leg, but refused evacuation until all casualties were secure. The room was silent. Harrison continued. In 2003, during the initial invasion of Iraq, Dalton's unit was ambushed in the city of Nasiriyah. The unit commander was killed in the first minutes of the engagement. Dalton assumed command, organized a defensive perimeter, and held off enemy forces for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. He turned a page. 18 soldiers survived that day because of her leadership. She received the Silver Star, the 3rd highest combat decoration in the United States Army. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Silver Star was not given lightly. Harrison held up another document. But those are the actions everyone knows about. What I'm about to tell you has been classified for nearly 20 years. Maggie's face went pale. General, please. I'm sorry, Maggie, but they need to know. He took a deep breath. In 2007, Command Sergeant Major Dalton volunteered for a special mission in Afghanistan, a covert operation to locate and extract American prisoners being held by a Taliban-affiliated group. The room was utterly still. The mission went wrong. Enemy forces were waiting. Of the 12-member team that went in, only 3 made it out. Dalton was one of them. Harrison's voice grew heavy. But before she escaped, she spent 11 days in enemy hands. 11 days of interrogation. 11 days of things I won't describe in this room. Maggie's hands were shaking. She never broke. She never gave up a single piece of information. And on the 12th day, she led the 2 other survivors in an escape that covered 18 miles through hostile territory. He closed the folder. The Army wanted to give her the Medal of Honor, but because the mission was classified, they couldn't. Instead, she received the Distinguished Service Cross, the 2nd highest award for valor. He looked at Maggie. She never told anyone, not her family, not her friends, not even her husband before he died. The room was completely silent. Harrison walked toward Maggie and stood before her. This woman was tortured for her country. She sacrificed things that no one should ever have to sacrifice, and she came home and lived quietly, asking for nothing. He turned to face the council. And you asked her to remove her medals, like they were costume jewelry, like they meant nothing. Briscoe's face was gray. He couldn't meet Harrison's eyes. You should be ashamed of yourselves, all of you. Harrison reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a medal, a bronze cross with a red ribbon. The Distinguished Service Cross. He turned back to Maggie. You left this in your file when you retired. You said you didn't want to be reminded. He placed it gently in her hand. But I think it's time you remembered, and I think it's time everyone else did too. Maggie looked down at the medal in her palm. Tears streamed silently down her face. The townspeople in the gallery began to stand, one by one, then in groups. Someone started clapping, then another, then the whole room. The applause thundered through the town hall, washing over the council table like a wave. Briscoe and his colleagues sat frozen, unable to move, unable to respond. For the first time in months, Maggie felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. The applause continued for a full minute. When it finally faded, General Harrison turned to face the council table. Mr. Briscoe, I suggest you end this hearing immediately and dismiss the zoning violation against Mrs. Dalton. Briscoe's hands trembled. General, we need to discuss this with our legal counsel. Your legal counsel is the one who helped manufacture this entire scheme. Harrison's voice was ice. I wouldn't count on him for much longer. Vincent Cross was already gathering his papers, his face pale. I have no further involvement in this matter, he said quickly. My firm will be withdrawing from the case. He headed for the door. Stop. Harrison's command froze Cross in his tracks. You're not going anywhere, Mr. Cross. My colleagues outside have some questions for you about your role in this corruption. Cross looked toward the door. The two military police officers stood blocking the exit. This is outrageous. You can't detain me. I'm a civilian attorney. They're not detaining you, Harrison smiled coldly. The FBI agents waiting outside will handle that. Cross's face went white. The doors opened and two men in dark suits entered. They showed their badges and approached Cross. Vincent Cross, FBI, we need you to come with us. Cross tried to protest, but the agents took him by the arms and led him out. The town hall buzzed with shocked whispers. Harrison turned back to the council. Now let's finish this properly. He nodded to Patricia, who stepped forward. Chairman Briscoe, I have here sworn statements from 3 former council members who resigned under pressure from Meridian Development. They allege that you personally threatened them with financial ruin if they didn't step down. She laid the documents on the table. I also have bank records showing the payments General Harrison mentioned earlier, and I have email correspondence between you and Meridian executives discussing how to remove obstacles, their words, to the development project. She looked at him steadily. Mrs. Dalton was one of those obstacles. Briscoe was sweating now. This is all circumstantial. You can't prove. The Texas Attorney General has already opened an investigation, Patricia interrupted. You'll have the opportunity to explain everything to them. One of the other council members, an older woman named Martha Jennings, who had been on the council for 20 years, stood up. I've heard enough. She looked at Briscoe with disgust. I never wanted any part of this. I kept quiet because I was afraid, but I'm not afraid anymore. She turned to face the room. I move that the zoning violation against Margaret Dalton be dismissed immediately. All in favor. 2 other council members, the ones who had been in Briscoe's pocket, sat frozen. I said all in favor. Slowly, reluctantly, they raised their hands. Martha raised hers. The council member next to her did the same. 4 votes, more than enough. The motion passes, Martha announced. The violation is dismissed. The room erupted in cheers. Maggie stood in the center of the chaos, still holding the Distinguished Service Cross in her hand. People rushed forward to embrace her, to shake her hand, to apologize for not speaking up sooner. General Harrison watched from the side, a small smile on his weathered face. Patricia approached him. That went well. Better than I expected, he paused. What happens to Briscoe now? He'll face charges. Corruption, fraud, conspiracy. He's looking at serious time. Harrison nodded. Good. He watched Maggie being surrounded by townspeople, her neighbors, her friends, people who had known her for decades but never knew the full truth of what she had done. She never wanted any of this, he said quietly. The attention, the recognition, she just wanted to be left alone. Patricia nodded. Some people serve without expecting anything in return. They're the real heroes. Harrison looked at the Distinguished Service Cross, still clutched in Maggie's hand. Yes, they are. 1 week later, the sun was setting over Ridgewood. Maggie sat on the porch of her farmhouse, watching the light fade over the hills. A glass of sweet tea sat on the table beside her. In the distance, she could see the old barn, the one that had caused all the trouble. It was still standing, just like her. The last 7 days had been a whirlwind. The FBI had arrested Vincent Cross and 2 Meridian executives on corruption charges. Harold Briscoe had resigned from the town council and was awaiting trial. The development project had been indefinitely suspended. The people of Ridgewood had rallied around Maggie. They had brought casseroles and pies. They had mowed her lawn and fixed her fence. They had apologized over and over for not standing up sooner. Maggie had accepted their apologies with grace. She understood fear. She understood what it took to stand up when everything was against you. Now, finally, she had a moment of peace. A truck pulled up the long driveway. Maggie recognized it immediately. General Harrison climbed out and walked toward the porch. "Evening, Sergeant Major." "Evening, General," she gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Have a seat." Harrison settled into the chair with a sigh. "Beautiful property. It's been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built this house with his own hands." Harrison nodded. "That's worth fighting for." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I never thanked you properly," Maggie said finally, "for what you did, for coming all this way." Harrison shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. You earned everything you have and a lot more." He paused. "I was in Washington when I got the call. An old friend from Ridgewood, someone who knew about your situation. He said they were going to railroad you out of your home. He said no one was standing up for you." He looked at her. "I couldn't let that happen, not to you, not after everything." Maggie's eyes glistened. "I spent my whole life trying to forget what happened over there. The missions, the capture, the 11 days. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I thought if I could just bury it deep enough, it would stop hurting." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "It never stops hurting, Maggie. I know that as well as anyone. But the hurt isn't just pain, it's proof. Proof that you survived. Proof that you're stronger than what tried to break you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a challenge coin, a medallion bearing the insignia of their old unit. "I've carried this for 30 years. Every soldier I served with signed the back." He turned it over. The back was covered in tiny signatures. "Your name is right there, 3rd row middle." Maggie took the coin and ran her finger over the signatures. Her own handwriting looked back at her from decades ago. "I remember signing this," she said softly, "the night before we deployed to Bosnia." "We lost 4 people on that deployment," Harrison said, "but everyone else came home because of soldiers like you." He stood up slowly. "Keep the coin, consider it a reminder." Maggie looked up at him. "A reminder of what?" "That you were never alone, and you never will be." He walked toward his truck, then stopped and turned back. "One more thing. The Army is planning a ceremony next month. They want to finally give you the Medal of Honor, publicly, with full military honors." Maggie's breath caught. "General, I don't need." "I know you don't need it, but the country needs to give it. We need to acknowledge what you did, what you sacrificed." He smiled. "Besides, it'll drive the politicians crazy. They hate having to admit they kept something classified for 20 years. Maggie laughed a real laugh, the first one in months. "All right, General, I'll be there." Harrison nodded. "Good, I'll see you in Washington." He climbed into his truck and drove away, disappearing down the dusty road. Maggie sat on her porch, holding the challenge coin in one hand and the Distinguished Service Cross in the other. She thought about everything she had been through. The wars, the wounds, the 11 days she never talked about, the husband she had buried, the daughter she had raised alone, the grandson who visited every summer and called her his hero. She had spent her whole life serving in silence, sacrificing without recognition, carrying burdens that no one else could see. But now, finally, she had been seen. Not as a victim, not as a problem to be solved. As a hero. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the Texas sky. The land around her was quiet and peaceful. The oak trees her grandfather had planted swayed gently in the evening breeze. She was home, she was safe, and no one would ever take that from her again. Maggie placed the medals on the table beside her tea and looked out at the land she had fought to keep. She had worn her uniform with pride. She had refused to remove her medals, and when the moment came, the truth had set her free. Command Sergeant Major Margaret Dalton had fought her final battle. And she had won.